In the first days of January 878, when most armies in England were supposed to be resting for the winter, a mounted Viking force slipped out of Mercia and rode toward the royal estate at Chippenham. King Alfred of Wessex was spending the Christmas season there. His regional levies had dispersed. His commanders were not gathered for war, and no field army stood between the king and the approaching enemy. The Vikings had chosen their moment carefully. They were not coming to raid an isolated monastery or carry away the wealth of a coastal town. They were coming for Alfred, and behind them rode the possibility of ending the last major Anglo-Saxon kingdom still capable of resisting them. Their commander was Guthrum, a veteran leader whose army had already crossed kingdoms, occupied fortified towns, broken agreements, and survived years of campaigning. By attacking in midwinter, he overturned the habits upon which Alfred's defences depended. The assault came so quickly that the king could not summon the men of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. Chippenham fell, the surrounding country was overrun, and Alfred escaped with only a small following. The consequences spread across Wessex faster than any royal order could travel. Some inhabitants fled overseas. Others submitted to Guthrum. Local leaders who might have fought as part of a royal army now faced the Vikings separately, without knowing whether Alfred was alive or whether another West Saxon force remained in the field. Within days, a kingdom that had resisted the Vikings for years appeared to have vanished. Alfred withdrew into the woods and marshes of Somerset. Guthrum controlled the roads, estates, and settlements from which an army could be supplied. A second Viking force was approaching Devon in 23 ships, threatening what remained of resistance in the west. The struggle for Wessex now turned on a question far larger than whether Alfred could survive in hiding. Could a king who had lost control of his kingdom persuade that kingdom to return to him? To understand how Wessex came so close to destruction, we have to return to the year 865, when Scandinavian warfare in England entered a new and far more dangerous phase. Viking attacks were not new. For generations, ships had appeared along the coasts of Britain, striking communities that could not assemble defenders in time. A raiding force could land, seize valuables and captives, and return to sea before a regional army arrived. But the force that came to East Anglia in 865 did not behave like the raiders who had preceded it. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called it a great heathen army. That name can create the impression of a single national force under centralized command, but the reality was probably a coalition of Scandinavian warbands led by several kings and commanders. Its exact size is unknown. What distinguished it was not simply numbers, but intention and staying power. The newcomers wintered in England. They obtained horses, allowing warriors who normally fought on foot to move rapidly between kingdoms. They seized fortified settlements, lived from conquered territory, demanded tribute, and negotiated when negotiation offered an advantage. Some intended to win land on which they could settle. Others continued campaigning. Together, they possessed the flexibility to raid, invade, bargain, divide, and reunite. East Anglia initially made peace with them and supplied horses. The Viking army then moved north toward York, where the kingdom of Northumbria had been weakened by a civil conflict between two rival kings, Osbert and Ella. Faced with a common enemy, the rivals temporarily reunited, but too late. Their forces entered York and fought inside the city, where both kings were killed. Northumbria's internal division had given the invaders their opportunity. The failed counterattack delivered the kingdom into their hands. The Viking leaders did not need to administer every conquered district themselves. They could support compliant rulers, occupy key settlements, or leave part of their force to control the land, while another group moved elsewhere. Their strength lay in forcing each Anglo-Saxon kingdom to confront them at a time and place of their choosing. In 868, the army moved to Nottingham in Mercia. King Burgred of Mercia appealed to Wessex for help, and a West Saxon force marched north under King Ethelred and his younger brother Alfred. They confronted the Vikings behind their defences, but did not force a decisive battle. The Mercians eventually made peace, leaving the Viking army intact. Alfred was still a prince, one of several royal brothers, and not expected to become king. Yet Nottingham gave him an early view of the problem that would define his reign. Viking armies were dangerous in open battle, but they were equally dangerous when protected by the walls and earthworks of an occupied settlement. Containing them required time and supplies. Attacking them directly could cost an army more men than a kingdom could replace. 2 years later, the Viking host entered East Anglia. King Edmund resisted and was defeated and killed. The circumstances of his death were later surrounded by religious tradition, but the political result is clear. East Anglia ceased to function as an independent obstacle to the invaders. The destruction of one kingdom opened routes toward another. In 874, the Vikings occupied Repton, drove King Burgred of Mercia overseas, and replaced him with Ceolwulf, a ruler who swore oaths and provided hostages. The chronicle portrays Ceolwulf as a puppet, although his actual position may have been more complicated. Whatever authority he retained depended upon an arrangement with the army that had removed his predecessor. Northumbria had fallen, East Anglia had fallen, Mercia had been divided and subordinated. Wessex remained. The first great struggle between Wessex and the Viking army had already taken place in 871. That campaign began when the invaders entered the kingdom and established themselves at Reading, where the Thames and Kennet provided waterways, supplies, and a defensible base. A local West Saxon force defeated a Viking detachment at Englefield, but the success encouraged a more dangerous move. King Ethelred and Alfred advanced against Reading itself. The Vikings emerged from the defences, and the West Saxons were driven back with heavy losses. 4 days later, the opposing armies met again at Ashdown. The Vikings divided their force into 2 parts, one led by their kings and another by their earls. The West Saxons also formed 2 divisions. According to later accounts, Ethelred delayed while attending religious observances, leaving Alfred to begin the engagement before the entire West Saxon line was ready. Whatever the exact circumstances, Alfred's division attacked, and the battle ended in a major West Saxon victory. Viking King Bagsec was killed along with several earls. For a brief moment, the outcome suggested that the invasion might have been broken. It had not. The Vikings still held strong positions and retained enough manpower to continue. At Basing, they defeated the West Saxons. At Meritoun, the armies fought another costly engagement, and the Vikings eventually controlled the field. King Ethelred died after Easter, perhaps from wounds or illness, and Alfred inherited the throne while the war was still underway. He was approximately 22 years old. He had become king not through a peaceful succession, but during a campaign that had already exhausted much of Wessex. A fresh Viking force arrived that summer. After 9 major battles and numerous smaller engagements, Alfred made peace. The terms are not known. Money may have changed hands, and the Vikings may simply have recognized that continued fighting carried unacceptable costs. Yet the settlement did not remove the wider danger. It sent the army elsewhere while Wessex recovered. The campaign taught Alfred a harsh lesson. A king could win a famous battle and remain in strategic danger. Ashdown killed important Viking leaders, but it did not eliminate their bases, mobility, or capacity for reinforcement. A victory mattered only if it changed what the enemy could do next. During the following years, the great army divided. Halfdan took part of it into Northumbria, where his followers settled and divided land. Another force, led by Guthrum, Oscytel and Anwend, moved to Cambridge in 875. Guthrum emerges from the sources through his decisions rather than through any surviving description of his personality. Nothing reliable tells us where he was born, how old he was, or how he first gained command. What the record does show is an experienced leader able to move a large force through hostile territory and use negotiation as part of military operations. In 876, Guthrum's army entered Wessex and occupied Wareham in Dorset. The settlement stood in a naturally protected position between two rivers, near Poole Harbour and routes leading deeper into the southwest. Once inside, the Vikings possessed the kind of defensive base that had frustrated Alfred before. The king chose containment rather than an immediate assault. Fighting through fortifications would have exposed his men to heavy losses, while a blockade offered the possibility of forcing an agreement. Negotiations followed. Guthrum's army provided high-ranking hostages and swore on a sacred arm ring that it would leave Alfred's kingdom. The oath carried special weight. According to the Chronicle, the Vikings had not previously offered such a guarantee to another people. Alfred appeared to have secured peace without paying the price of storming Wareham. Then the mounted portion of Guthrum's army slipped away at night. The hostages and oath had not ended the operation. They had helped conceal its next movement. Viking horsemen rode west toward Exeter, leaving Alfred to discover that the army he had contained was already beyond his reach. He followed as quickly as he could, but the pursuit failed. Guthrum reached Exeter before the West Saxons could intercept him and took shelter behind another defensible position. Alfred again faced the choice between a costly assault and patient containment. He chose to wait. This time, however, Guthrum expected support from the sea. A Viking fleet sailed west around the coast, carrying men and supplies that could strengthen the position at Exeter. If it arrived, Alfred might be forced to fight a reinforced army or watch it move into another part of Wessex. The fleet never reached Guthrum. A severe storm caught the ships near Swanage. The Chronicle claims that 120 vessels were lost. That number cannot be verified and may not be exact, but the disaster was serious enough to alter the campaign. Men drowned, ships disappeared, and the support upon which Guthrum had depended was gone. The balance around Exeter changed without a major land battle. Isolated from the fleet and contained by Alfred's forces, Guthrum negotiated again. He provided hostages and renewed his promises of peace. In 877, the army withdrew into Mercia. The departure appeared to give Wessex breathing room. Part of Mercia was being divided among Viking settlers, and Guthrum's men had endured the failure of two successive positions inside Alfred's kingdom. There were sound reasons for Alfred to believe that the immediate threat had passed, but Guthrum had not been defeated in the field. His army had not been disarmed or destroyed. From Mercia, he remained close to Wessex's northern frontier, and he had now seen how Alfred responded to fortified occupations, how quickly West Saxon armies could move, and when those armies were most likely to be dispersed. As 877 ended, Alfred spent the Christmas season at Chippenham. It was a royal estate and administrative centre in northern Wiltshire, well connected to surrounding lands. It offered food, accommodation, and a place for the king to conduct business. It was also dangerously close to Mercia. The traditional campaigning season had ended. The regional levies had returned home, because keeping thousands of men assembled through winter was costly and disruptive. Fields, households, animals, and estates still required labour. Anglo-Saxon kings could summon military service, but they did not maintain a large, permanent field army capable of responding instantly in every season. That weakness was built into the way Wessex made war. A royal summons moved outward through ealdormen, thegns, and local communities, each responsible for gathering men from a particular area. When the system worked, it could produce a substantial army. But it needed warning, recognized assembly points, and enough time for contingents to leave their homes and join the king. It could not instantly place thousands of men around Chippenham simply because danger had crossed the frontier. Winter made the problem worse. Roads deteriorated, daylight shortened, and moving food for a large host became more difficult. Those conditions usually discouraged major operations, which is precisely why Guthrum could expect surprise. His men did not need to conquer every district during the first advance. They needed to reach Alfred before Wessex could become an army. Guthrum chose that weakness as the centre of his plan. Shortly after Twelfth Night, his mounted force left Mercia and moved into Wessex. The chronicle says the army stole away to Chippenham, language that captures the secrecy and suddenness of the advance. The exact date is uncertain, although the attack came in early January 878. Alfred received too little warning to assemble the Shire levies. Guthrum's men occupied Chippenham and spread through the surrounding country. By taking the royal centre while the West Saxon military system was inactive, the Vikings separated Alfred from the men and resources he needed to resist them. The loss extended beyond the buildings of a royal estate. Chippenham connected the king to food rents, horses, officials, guests, and the local networks through which orders travelled. Once Guthrum controlled it, any message claiming to come from Alfred had to compete with the visible fact that Viking troops occupied the king's own centre. Communities farther away were forced to make decisions with incomplete information. Waiting for Alfred might invite punishment. Submitting to Guthrum might protect a household or estate, but it also made the collapse of royal resistance more likely. Guthrum's mounted detachments could magnify that uncertainty. They did not have to garrison every village. By appearing along roads, collecting supplies, and accepting submission from important local men, they could create the impression that organized resistance had already ended. Political control in the 9th century depended heavily upon personal presence. Alfred's absence, therefore, became almost as damaging as the loss of territory itself. The king escaped, but little about that escape is securely known. Later generations filled the gap with stories, including the famous tale in which a woman unknowingly asks Alfred to watch her cakes and scolds him when he allows them to burn. That episode does not appear in the contemporary chronicle or in Asser's biography of Alfred. It belongs to the later legend, not to the evidence for the campaign. The reality was dangerous enough. Alfred withdrew with a small group into wooded and marshy country. He could not know how many nobles had submitted, how far Viking detachments had spread, or whether messages sent in his name would reach their destinations. Guthrum did not need to hunt down every opponent. If enough of Wessex accepted the new order, Alfred's political power would disappear even while he remained alive. The chronicle describes a rapid collapse. Many inhabitants were driven overseas. Most of those who remained were subdued. A ruler whose authority had once extended across southern England was reduced to moving through terrain where a large mounted army could not easily follow. Guthrum's strategy had succeeded because he had attacked the structure of the kingdom rather than waiting to meet its army. At Chippenham, he prevented that army from forming. The threat soon became even greater. During the same winter, another Viking leader arrived in Devon with 23 ships. The chronicle calls him the brother of Ivar and Halfdan. Later tradition often identifies him as Ubba, but the earliest accounts do not securely establish the name. The Western force created the possibility of a coordinated disaster. Guthrum controlled northern Wessex. A second Viking army was operating in Devon. Between them lay Somerset, where Alfred's remaining supporters were trying to survive. If the two Viking forces linked together, resistance in the southwest might be crushed before Alfred could rebuild it. The king's refuge was Athelney, a raised area amid the wetlands of the Somerset levels, near the river systems of the Tone and Parrett. In the 9th century, this was a landscape of marshes, channels, flooded ground, and scattered islands of firmer earth. Roads were limited, movement depended upon local knowledge, and a mounted force could not cross it with the speed it enjoyed on open ground. Athelney offered protection, but not comfort or control. The wetlands could hide Alfred from Guthrum, yet they also restricted Alfred's access to the rest of Wessex. Food had to come from nearby communities. Messages had to pass through territory where capture could expose the king's plans. Every local family that supported him risked retaliation. The contrast between the two commanders was now striking. Guthrum could send men along established routes and draw resources from occupied estates. Alfred depended upon narrow approaches through country known best by the people who lived there. Yet that limitation also gave him a form of security. A large Viking column could not move through the levels without revealing itself, and horses that had made Guthrum's winter attacks so effective offered far less advantage among watercourses and unstable ground. Alfred therefore used the one region Guthrum could not easily dominate to preserve the one institution the Vikings had failed to capture, the kingship itself. As long as Alfred remained alive, issued commands, rewarded loyalty, and appeared with armed followers, submission to Guthrum was not necessarily final. The contest continued in the choices of local men who supplied one side, carried messages for the other, or waited to see which leader could assemble real strength. Around Easter, Alfred built a fortification there. It should not be imagined as a great stone castle. It was more likely an earth and timber stronghold adapted to the terrain and intended to protect a small force. From this base, Alfred and the nearby men of Somerset began attacking Viking positions and foraging parties. The sources do not describe each raid, and there is no need to enlarge them into battles. Their purpose was cumulative. They showed that Alfred remained active. They interrupted the enemy's use of the countryside, gathered supplies and information, and preserved links with communities that had not fully submitted. Yet Athelney could not become a permanent answer. Guthrum possessed productive land and important routes. Alfred possessed a defensible island. Unless the king left the marshes and assembled a field army, time would eventually favour the invader. Before he could attempt that movement, the western threat had to be resolved. In Devon, the Viking force from the 23 ships encountered a group of West Saxon defenders. Later sources place the confrontation at a stronghold called Sinuit, but its location remains disputed. Countisbury in northern Devon and Cannington near the Quantock Hills have both been proposed, along with other sites. The identity of the West Saxon commander is also uncertain. Later tradition gives the victory to Ealdorman Odda, but the earliest principal accounts do not name him in their descriptions of the battle. Asser provides the clearest surviving narrative. The Viking army surrounded a West Saxon fort whose defenders lacked a dependable supply of water. The obvious strategy was to wait. Hunger and thirst would accomplish what an assault might not. For the trapped West Saxons, delay promised destruction. Remaining behind the defences meant growing weaker until surrender or a final failed resistance became unavoidable. They made the opposite decision. Rather than waiting to be overwhelmed, they concentrated their remaining strength and attacked the besiegers. The sortie reversed the roles of the two forces. The Vikings, who had expected to control the timing, were caught by an attack from men they believed were trapped. Their commander was killed, and the army suffered a severe defeat. The chronicle reports that 840 men died and that the West Saxons captured the Raven banner, a symbol associated with the Viking force. The casualty figure cannot be independently confirmed, but the destruction was clearly substantial. The victory did not remove Guthrum from Wessex. It did something Alfred urgently needed. It eliminated the army that threatened his western flank. The Vikings in Devon would not march east to close the trap around Somerset. It may also have altered the calculations of men who had not yet committed themselves. Guthrum's occupation had looked overwhelming when two Viking forces threatened the southwest at once. After the defeat in Devon, the image of inevitable conquest was damaged. One invading army had been surrounded and destroyed by men who were themselves supposed to be trapped. Guthrum still held the stronger position, but events were no longer moving in only one direction. News of the victory also carried political meaning. Resistance was no longer confined to Alfred's small force at Athelney. West Saxon troops had defeated a Viking army without the king's direct presence. Guthrum controlled much of the kingdom, but he did not control every community capable of taking up arms. By the weeks after Easter, Alfred was preparing to leave the marshes. His challenge was not simply to send an order calling men to war. A summons had to identify a rendezvous that forces from different shires could reach without being intercepted. Men from Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire had to move separately before they could unite. If Guthrum learned the location in time, he could attack one contingent while the others were still on the road. Alfred selected a place known as Egbert's Stone, east of Selwood Forest. Its precise modern location is uncertain. Various sites near the borders of Somerset and Wiltshire have been proposed, but none has been conclusively identified. What matters is its function. Selwood formed a broad wooded barrier between Alfred's refuge and the country to the east. A meeting point on its far side allowed forces from several regions to converge, while the forest helped conceal movement from the west. Messengers carried the summons. Alfred could not be certain how it would be received. Some men had already submitted to Guthrum. Others had fled. Local leaders faced the risk of abandoning their homes and exposing their families to Viking retaliation. Alfred's months in the marshes had preserved his life, but they may also have made his strength difficult to judge. In the 7th week after Easter, probably in the middle of May 878, Alfred rode from Athelney toward Egbert's Stone. Leaving the wetlands was a calculated risk. Once he crossed into more open country, the terrain that had protected his small following could no longer compensate for its lack of numbers. If the Shire forces failed to appear, Guthrum would have an opportunity to finish the campaign. The men came. The levy of Somerset gathered around the king. Men from Wiltshire joined them, despite Guthrum's occupation of Chippenham and the surrounding region. A surviving contingent from Hampshire also reached the rendezvous. Asser, writing a favourable account of Alfred's reign, says that they rejoiced when they saw him. The emotion cannot be measured, but the political fact is unmistakable. Alfred had reappeared, and thousands of men were prepared to recognize his authority by following him into battle. Their arrival solved one problem and immediately created several others. Men reaching the rendezvous at different times had to be assigned places, placed under leaders they recognized, and supplied without exhausting the surrounding district. Somerset had supported Alfred during his months at Athelney, while many Wiltshire men came from country exposed directly to Guthrum's occupation. The Hampshire contingent had travelled from farther east. Each group brought different information about Viking movements, and not all of that information would have been current or reliable. Alfred could not wait for perfect knowledge. If he delayed in hopes of gathering every possible reinforcement, Guthrum would gain time to discover the muster, strengthen his position, or move against one of the shires that had declared for the king. The very act of assembling the army had announced that neutrality was ending. Alfred now had to make the gathering matter before Guthrum could punish the communities that had supported it. The army that formed at Egbert Stone was probably measured in several thousand, but no reliable total survives. Modern estimates vary, and precise figures should be treated as reconstruction rather than fact. Guthrum's strength is equally uncertain. Alfred's force was not simply an undisciplined crowd of peasants. At its centre were likely the king's household warriors, the retainers of nobles and thanes, and men with experience from earlier campaigns. Around them gathered the regional levy, raised through obligations connected to landholding, lordship, and royal authority. Equipment varied sharply. Wealthier warriors could possess iron helmets, mail shirts, swords, and well-made shields. Many others probably came with a spear, a round wooden shield, a knife, and little metal protection. The shires had answered, but they had only just come together. Guthrum's army contained men who had campaigned across England for years. They had occupied York, Nottingham, Wareham, Exeter, and Chippenham. They knew how to use horses for rapid movement, and how to fight on foot in close formation. Alfred had recovered numbers. He had not erased the enemy's experience. Nor could he keep his host at Egbert Stone indefinitely. A gathered levy consumed food quickly. The longer it remained stationary, the greater the chance that Guthrum would discover its size, threaten another region, or force Alfred to disperse. The king chose to advance. The day after the muster, the West Saxons moved to a place the sources call Ely Oak, or Eclia. Its exact location is also disputed. The army camped there for a night, then continued toward Edington. The staged march suggests control rather than a spontaneous rush. Separate shire contingents had to remain together. Scouts had to watch the approaches, and supplies had to follow. Men who had recently left farms and estates were moving toward an army that had conquered 3 kingdoms. Guthrum now faced a situation he had tried to prevent at Chippenham. Alfred had reassembled Wessex in military form. If Guthrum allowed that army to move unchallenged, other districts might reject Viking control and join it. The political momentum of the winter offensive would disappear. Avoiding battle carried serious risks. Defeating Alfred carried the possibility of ending the war. The armies met at Edington, generally identified with modern Edington in Wiltshire, near Westbury and the northern edge of Salisbury Plain. The identification is widely accepted, but not archaeologically proven. The exact battlefield has never been securely located. Bratton Camp and the surrounding chalk escarpment dominate many modern reconstructions, yet there is no firm evidence that Guthrum occupied that hill fort or that Alfred ordered a specific uphill assault beneath it. What can be said is that Edington lay along a plausible line between Alfred's advance from the southwest and Guthrum's base around Chippenham. The surrounding landscape offered open ground on which substantial infantry formations could meet, with higher chalk country nearby and routes leading north toward the Viking-held region. Guthrum's men had used horses for operational speed, but that does not mean they fought as organized cavalry. Like the West Saxons, they probably dismounted and formed a dense infantry line. Both forces relied primarily upon spears and round shields. Swords and specialized axes existed, but they were not carried by every warrior. Mail and helmets were more common among leaders and wealthy retainers than among the entire army. The similarity of their weapons made organization more important than any technological advantage. Neither commander possessed a device that could simply break the opposing line from a distance. Victory depended upon bringing men into position, keeping them together under pressure, and exploiting disorder when it appeared. Guthrum's veterans had done this across several kingdoms. Alfred's men had the advantage of fighting close to their own communities, but that motivation could matter only if their leaders prevented the newly assembled host from fragmenting during contact. No contemporary source preserves a detailed deployment. There is no reliable description of separate wings, a hidden reserve, a flanking column, or a prearranged trap. The evidence supports a simpler and more brutal confrontation. Asser says Alfred fought with his whole army in a compact formation and resisted fiercely until the Vikings gave way. From within either line, knowledge would have been limited. A commander might see only part of the formation through ranks of men, shields, weapons, and uneven ground. Orders could be carried by voice, horn, standard, or messenger. But once the lines met, noise and compression made control increasingly difficult. A warrior near the center might know that the men beside him were holding, without knowing whether another section had begun to retreat. Standards and familiar leaders helped men identify their place, but they could not provide a commander with a modern view of the field. Alfred's influence depended upon the chain of men around him: household warriors, senior nobles, local commanders, and the ranks that followed them. Guthrum relied upon a comparable network among his veteran bands. If one leader fell or a standard moved unexpectedly, the effect could spread beyond the immediate loss, because nearby warriors might no longer understand where the line was meant to stand. The opposing formations moved together. Missile weapons may have been used before contact, but their role at Edington is not recorded. The decisive work belonged to the close infantry line. Shields covered the body and overlapped or pressed close enough to protect neighboring men. Spears reached beyond the front rank until the distance collapsed. Men behind the first line added weight, replaced casualties, and prevented those ahead from being pushed backward. This was not an orderly contest between identical walls that remained fixed until one side politely withdrew. Dense formations shifted. A fallen man created an obstacle. A damaged shield opened a narrow space. Warriors in the rear pressed forward without always seeing why the men ahead had stopped. Small movements could spread along the line, and a local loss of footing or cohesion could expose the men beside it. Alfred's greatest immediate task was to keep contingents from different shires acting as one army. If one group mistook a controlled movement for retreat, the break could widen. If men pursued too early, they could leave neighboring units exposed. Guthrum faced the same danger, but his veterans possessed more experience fighting together. The sources do not reveal when the balance changed or which portion of the Viking line weakened first. They record the result. Alfred's compact formation endured, and Guthrum's army was driven from the field. That silence in the sources is important. Later retellings often supply Edington with a detailed maneuver, a dramatic speech, or a precisely located charge. None is securely recorded. The decisive achievement visible in the evidence is less theatrical but militarily demanding. Alfred brought together contingents that had been scattered only months earlier, advanced them into contact with an experienced enemy, and kept the combined force coherent long enough for Guthrum's resistance to fail. The break may have begun locally, with men giving ground under pressure. Once a formation started moving backward, those behind the front could not easily distinguish an adjustment from collapse. Shields no longer faced in one direction. Gaps widened. Warriors who had relied on the men beside them found themselves exposed. Retreat became rout. For Alfred, that moment created a choice. His men had survived the central contest and could claim the battlefield. They were also tired, disordered, and tempted by weapons, horses, or valuables left behind. A pursuit risked breaking the formation that had produced the victory. Guthrum's men might rally, turn on scattered pursuers, and inflict severe losses, but allowing the Vikings to escape intact would repeat the strategic failure of earlier victories. Guthrum still possessed a fortified refuge. If his army reached it in good order, recovered its supplies, and restored communication with the surrounding country, Alfred could find himself facing the same enemy again. The West Saxons pursued. The chronicle says Alfred followed Guthrum's army as far as its fortification. Those who could not reach safety were killed or captured. The victors seized horses, livestock, and other resources left outside the defences. Each capture mattered beyond its value as plunder. A horse taken from the Vikings could not carry a scout or raiding party. Livestock captured by Alfred could feed his army while denying food to the men behind the walls. The exact fortified position is not identified with certainty. It is often assumed to have been Chippenham, but the sources do not state this plainly enough to remove all doubt. Wherever Guthrum's survivors gathered, they retained defensive protection but had lost control of the surrounding ground. The direction of the campaign had completely reversed. In January, Guthrum's sudden advance had sent Alfred into the marshes. In May, Alfred's army had driven Guthrum's men behind defences. Alfred did not order an immediate assault. Reading had shown him what could happen when West Saxons attacked Vikings in a strong position. Exeter had demonstrated that containment could succeed when an enemy's supplies or reinforcement failed. At Edington, Alfred combined battlefield victory with blockade. His forces surrounded the Viking position and waited. The siege lasted 14 nights. Encirclement did not mean that Alfred's men stood shoulder to shoulder around every yard of the defences. They needed to watch gates, paths, and any ground across which the Vikings might escape or obtain food. Patrols and local knowledge would have mattered, especially after darkness, when a small party might attempt to pass through the lines. The West Saxons also had to prevent their own blockade from becoming predictable. If Guthrum identified a weak section, a concentrated breakout could reopen the campaign. Inside, the Viking commanders faced an increasingly narrow set of choices. Remaining behind the works preserved lives for the moment, but consumed whatever provisions remained. Breaking out offered mobility at the risk of another battle against men who now held the surrounding ground. Waiting for rescue required confidence that another force knew their position, could reach it, and was willing to challenge Alfred's reunited army. Each passing day weakened all three possibilities. For Guthrum, the fortification offered security from immediate destruction, but its value declined with every day. The defeated army had lost men in the battle and pursuit. Animals and supplies outside the defences were in West Saxon hands. Foraging was no longer possible without fighting through Alfred's cordon. No relief army was known to be approaching. The force in Devon had already been destroyed, and the fleet that might once have supported operations in the southwest no longer existed. Hunger began to do what weapons had not. Alfred's position was not without risk. A regional levy could not remain in the field forever. His men also required food, and the surrounding countryside had already endured occupation and campaigning. Disease could spread through a stationary force. Guthrum might organize a desperate breakout, concentrating his best warriors against one section of the blockade before Alfred could reinforce it. Other Viking groups remained active elsewhere in England. If Alfred waited too long, news of his concentration might draw a new threat toward Wessex. The king needed Guthrum to surrender before the strain began to fracture his own army. For 2 weeks, neither side obtained an easy escape from the situation. The Vikings could not safely leave. Alfred could not storm the defences without paying a price that might undo his victory. The blockade also tested Alfred's authority in a different way from the battle. At Edington, men could see the enemy directly and understand the immediate purpose of holding the line. During the following days, the king had to keep a temporary host in position while the expected climax failed to arrive. Supplies had to be collected, watches maintained, disputes controlled, and men prevented from drifting home with captured property. The ability to sustain that pressure was evidence that the political recovery begun at Egbert Stone had survived its first major test. Then Guthrum offered terms. His men promised to provide hostages, swear that they would leave Alfred's kingdom, and accept whatever peace the king imposed. Most strikingly, Guthrum agreed to receive Christian baptism. The proposal reflected the completeness of the reversal. At Wareham, the Vikings had given hostages and sworn on their sacred ring, then used the agreement to cover a nighttime escape. After Edington, Alfred would again receive hostages, but there is no indication that he provided hostages in return. The two sides were no longer negotiating as equals. Alfred nevertheless chose not to destroy Guthrum. That decision was practical as well as political. An assault would kill West Saxon soldiers, perhaps many of them. Starving the defenders until they could no longer resist might take longer than Alfred's levy could remain assembled. Guthrum, by contrast, could still command his followers and lead them out of Wessex if allowed to live. The promised baptism offered something the earlier oaths had lacked. It would place Guthrum inside a Christian political order recognized by the rulers and clergy of Anglo-Saxon England. Alfred would become not merely the commander who had defeated him, but his sponsor within that order. Accepting the terms also acknowledged a military reality. Even after the rout and blockade, Guthrum remained the leader best able to control the surviving Vikings. Killing or removing him could splinter the army into smaller bands, with no single commander capable of enforcing departure. By preserving Guthrum's status under new conditions, Alfred gained a counterpart who could deliver hostages, lead his followers out of Wessex, and later negotiate as a ruler responsible for a defined population. 3 weeks after the surrender, Guthrum came to Aller in Somerset. There he received baptism, with Alfred serving as his godfather. Guthrum took the Christian name Ethelstan, a name also borne by one of Alfred's deceased brothers. The ceremony should not be reduced to a simple scene of humiliation, nor can it be used to prove what Guthrum privately believed. Conversion could possess religious meaning and political utility at the same time. It allowed a defeated Viking commander to re-emerge as a recognized Christian ruler. It allowed Alfred to turn a dangerous enemy into a man bound to him through a public spiritual relationship. 8 days later, at Wedmore, Guthrum's baptismal headband or ceremonial cloth was removed. He and his leading followers remained with Alfred for 12 days, during which the king gave them gifts. The gifts did not erase the fact of defeat. They demonstrated what Alfred wanted the settlement to become. Guthrum would leave Wessex, but he would not leave as a fugitive leader with nothing to lose. He would depart as a ruler whose future position was connected to the agreement he had made with Alfred. The immediate settlement is often called the Treaty of Wedmore. No surviving document with that title records the terms agreed after Edington. The written treaty of Alfred and Guthrum belongs to a later stage, probably sometime in the 80s. It established a boundary between their territories and addressed compensation, trade, and relations between English and Scandinavian communities. It should not be imagined as a complete legal settlement drafted at Wedmore immediately after the battle. What happened in 878 was narrower but more urgent. Guthrum promised to leave Wessex. Alfred accepted his submission, sponsored his baptism, and allowed him to retain enough authority to carry that promise out. In 879, Guthrum's army moved from Chippenham to Cirencester in Mercia, where it remained for roughly a year. In 880, the force moved into East Anglia and divided the land for settlement. The movement was gradual, which is another reason to avoid presenting the settlement as an instant expulsion. Guthrum's followers remained an organized body and still required a place to live. Their year at Cirencester placed them outside Alfred's core kingdom while they determined their next destination. Settlement in East Anglia then changed the army's relationship with the land. Warriors who had moved from campaign to campaign became rulers, landholders, and farmers, although military power remained central to their position. For communities in East Anglia, this was not a return to the political order that had existed before King Edmund's defeat. Scandinavian leaders and settlers now held lasting power. Yet Guthrum's use of the name Aethelstan on his coinage shows that accommodation was already altering the conquerors as well. Ruling territory demanded more than winning battles. It required recognizable kingship, exchange, law, and dealings with neighboring Christian rulers. Guthrum, now ruling under the Christian name Aethelstan, did not disappear from history. He became king in East Anglia, issued coins under his baptismal name, and remained there until his death in 890. His survival reveals what Edington did and did not accomplish. Alfred had not exterminated Guthrum's army or expelled all Scandinavian power from England. He had forced a formidable rival out of Wessex and redirected his search for land. Large parts of England remained under Scandinavian control. Viking settlers were cultivating land in Northumbria and East Anglia. Mercia remained divided. New armies could still arrive from across the sea or move from the continent. Indeed, another Viking force appeared at Fulham not long after the campaign. The inhabitants of Wessex could not simply return to the world that had existed before Chippenham. Guthrum's winter attack had revealed how quickly a mobile army could bypass local resistance, seize a royal centre, and prevent the shires from assembling. Alfred had survived because he escaped, because the Somerset wetlands gave him shelter, because the Viking army in Devon was destroyed, and because the regional levies still answered his call. Depending on that same chain of events, a second time would be reckless. During the years after Edington, Alfred began developing a more resilient system of defence. He established or strengthened fortified settlements, known as burhs, across Wessex. These were not merely isolated castles. They were protected centres linked to surrounding populations, roads, estates, and military obligations. A burh could provide refuge when raiders appeared. It could store supplies, protect markets and administrative activity, and deny a Viking army easy control of a district. From its walls, a garrison could survive until a field force arrived. A network of such places made it harder for an invader to repeat Guthrum's achievement at Chippenham by capturing one centre and watching the surrounding country collapse. Alfred also reorganized military service so that part of his manpower could remain available while another portion stayed home. The evidence for the precise system and its chronology is incomplete, but the objective is clear. Wessex needed men ready to respond without keeping the entire farming population permanently mobilized. He devoted further effort to ships. Alfred did not create English naval warfare from nothing. Earlier Anglo-Saxon kings had used fleets. His measures formed part of a wider attempt to contest Viking movement by land and sea rather than waiting for raiders to choose a landing place. These reforms developed over time. They were not the hidden weapon that won Edington, and they should not be projected backward into the spring of 878. They were the response of a ruler who had seen the existing system fail almost completely. When a new major Viking coalition attacked in 892, Wessex faced another difficult war. This time, fortified centres, mobile field forces, local garrisons, and improved coordination made sudden political collapse far less likely. Viking armies could still raid, maneuver, and win local successes, but capturing territory became harder when defended settlements restricted their movement and denied them secure bases. Edington therefore mattered twice. It saved Alfred's kingdom in the immediate crisis, and it gave him the time and authority to change how that kingdom defended itself. The political consequences extended beyond Wessex. In 886, Alfred occupied and restored London, a city positioned along one of the most important river and land routes in southern England. He entrusted it to Ethelred, the Mercian ruler who was also Alfred's ally and later his son-in-law. The move strengthened cooperation between surviving English territories and expanded Alfred's authority beyond the traditional bounds of his kingdom. London gave that expanding authority a strategic centre. The city stood on the Thames, connected inland routes with maritime traffic, and faced territories influenced or occupied by Scandinavian rulers. Restoring its defences protected commerce, but it also allowed Alfred to present himself as the ruler capable of recovering and holding places beyond Wessex. The significance of Edington was therefore beginning to move outward. Survival had created the possibility of leadership over other English communities. The chronicle claimed that all English people not under Danish rule then submitted to Alfred. That statement reflects the political ambitions of Alfred's court and should not be read as proof that a unified England already existed. Even so, it points toward a changing idea of kingship. Alfred was increasingly presented not simply as king of the West Saxons, but as the protector of English communities outside Scandinavian control. His children continued the process. Edward the Elder expanded West Saxon power. Alfred's daughter Aethelflaed, remembered as the Lady of the Mercians, directed fortification and military operations across Mercia. Together, their campaigns reduced Scandinavian control in the Midlands and created new lines from which English forces could advance. Later rulers extended that authority northward. In the 10th century, Alfred's grandson Aethelstan became the first king generally recognized as ruling a united England. That kingdom was not created on the battlefield at Edington, and its formation was neither immediate nor inevitable. It emerged through decades of warfare, diplomacy, fortification, marriage, settlement, and political integration. But all of those later developments depended upon the survival of a functioning West Saxon monarchy. Had Guthrum captured or killed Alfred at Chippenham, Wessex might have followed the path of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. A compliant ruler could have been installed. The kingdom might have been divided among Scandinavian settlers. Resistance could have continued locally, but without the royal structure that later coordinated English reconquest. Edington prevented that outcome. It did not erase Scandinavian influence. Norse and Danish settlement became a permanent part of England's development. Scandinavian place names spread across large regions. Language, trade, law, urban life and patterns of landholding were changed through contact between newcomers and existing communities. Guthrum's East Anglia was not simply an enemy occupation waiting to disappear. It became one part of the political and cultural world from which medieval England emerged. The battle also did not permanently end Viking attacks. Alfred spent much of the remainder of his reign preparing for and fighting further threats. His successors continued wars against Scandinavian rulers, and England would face new waves of invasion in later centuries. The importance of 878 lies in a narrower and more consequential fact. At the beginning of that year, Guthrum understood exactly how to exploit Wessex's weakness. He attacked in winter, struck at the king before the levies could assemble, occupied a royal centre, and forced communities to decide their future without a visible West Saxon army. It was one of the most effective Viking operations ever conducted in England. Alfred's recovery did not come from a single brilliant maneuver. It came through a chain of decisions in which failure at any point could have ended his reign. He escaped instead of making a hopeless stand. He used Athelney's terrain rather than challenging Guthrum too soon. West Saxon defenders in Devon attacked rather than waiting to die of thirst. Messengers reached the shires. The shires answered. Alfred advanced before his new army lost momentum. At Edington, the formation held. After the Vikings broke, he pursued them. When they reached their defences, he resisted the temptation to throw his men against the walls and chose a blockade instead. The victory was completed not when Guthrum left the battlefield, but when hunger forced him to give hostages, accept baptism, and leave Wessex. In January, Alfred had been a king without an army. By May, he had rebuilt that army and reversed the invasion. In the years that followed, he rebuilt the kingdom so that its survival would no longer depend upon one man reaching a marsh before his enemies caught him. Edington did not end the Viking Age, and it did not create England in a single day. It preserved the one kingdom that could, and in time, would.